All right, I think we're good. Hello again. My name is Richard. Welcome to the Anything F1 channel. Today we're going to be talking about the British Grand Prix and looking at the next Grand Prix, which is dang, what's the next Grand Prix? The Hungarian Grand Prix. I knew that. Definitely. Um yeah, so the British Grand Prix, if you haven't already seen it, I suggest you go watch it or go watch the highlights. Long story short, Max Verstappen won the race, but it wasn't easy. We'll get to that in a second. He won the race. Second was Lando Norris. Third was Lewis Hamilton. Overall, I would say the race was okay. Not a lot of passing. I think it's just with these current rules, or specifically the changes they made for 2023, the cars don't follow us closely anymore. So straights are only, or passes will only happen on the straights, which is what happened, and they weren't that often. So it was an okay to good race. Definitely had some tension throughout. Qualifying, we had Max Verstappen on pole as expected, but he was followed by both McLarens, who throughout the entire season have been incredibly slow, consistently slow, and not scoring many points. Lando Norris, it wasn't until the last two races, including the British Grand Prix, where they've finally been able to get better, improve. Started off with the fourth place in Austria, now a podium. So it looks like their upgrades are actually working how they're supposed to be working, which is good. But at the same time, it's still not enough to challenge the Red Bulls. And it could just be a one-off thing. This is a very specific track. It covers very high-speed turns. We saw the Williams earlier in the weekend be incredibly fast throughout the practice sessions. Unfortunately, during qualifying, they got caught out with mixed conditions. Same thing with Perez for the fifth time in a row, not making it past Q1, which is very dangerous, especially the fact that he's in a Red Bull seat, which, again, we'll get into that a little bit later. So qualifying, the way that the results went, you had Max on pole, Lando Norris second, Piastri third, then Charles Leclerc, Sainz, Russell, Hamilton, Albon, Alonso, Gasly, Hulkenberg, Stroll, Ocon, Sargent, Perez, Sonoda, Guan Yu Zhou, Nick DeVries, Kevin Magnussen, and Valtteri Bottas. Bottas was last because in Q1, his engine failed on him, but he had already set a good enough time to make it into Q2, but he couldn't set a time in Q2, so he would have started 15th, but he ended up getting disqualified from qualifying for other reasons, and now he starts last. And at the very beginning of the Grand Prix, Lando Norris, let's start ahead of him. Max Verstappen had, to put it quite frank, a terrible start. He he got a good launch, but for some reason the Red Bull, they get good launches, so their reaction time is fine. But for some reason, they keep getting wheel spin, and the car is not hooking up the way that it should be after first gear. At least it's a problem with Max Verstappen, because in the past two races, he's had problems with the start where he's almost or does get past at the start. So at the start, Lando Norris gets past him, and he leads the British Grand Prix, which is insane for watching it live. And I'm sure if you were there in person, it would have been insane. You could hear the crowd go absolutely crazy on the broadcast, and that was fun to watch. And then after that, it's a pretty close. Oscar Piastri's kind of challenging Max, but after the first lap, it kind of settles down for a second. And Norris holds Max Verstappen for about 5 laps, and then he gets past them, and then Max Verstappen says goodbye. Not totally goodbye. He's faster than everybody else, but he's not beating them by like 20 seconds. He's only there ends up being a safety car later on, but even by the safety car, he's only like 6 seconds ahead, which is not that lot, which is not a lot compared to previous races where he's been winning by like 30, 20 seconds, even ahead of his teammate. So that's always good to see, but he gets past them. Perez slowly starts making progress up the field, and to be honest, nothing really happens for a good amount of time. It isn't until Kevin Magnussen's engine blows up, they cut to the main straight. Now, I don't think they knew that it was happening, but you can see a puff of smoke coming out from one of the cars, and then it pulls off to the side, and he's going very slow. It's pretty evident that he has a engine failure. So there's a virtual safety car, then an actual safety car, which hurt and benefited quite a few people. So there was a few teams, I believe Perez, I know Perez was definitely one of them, but there was a few drivers who, because they pitted before the safety car, didn't get a good advantage when the safety car came out. So you had people like Hamilton jump 2 places or jump 1 place and get it into third ahead of Oscar Piastri, which Piastri, if that safety car didn't happen, you probably would have seen him get a podium as well. Just because it was really hard to overtake. I mean, that's a maybe. That's more speculation. But as it is now, on the restart, it gets pretty exciting because Lando Norris is on hard tires. Well, pretty much the rest of the field is on soft or medium tires, so they have the tire advantage at the beginning. And you see Hamilton trying to challenge him for quite a few laps, but never gets through. And you see Perez, well, he was stuck behind Carlos Sainz, who was holding a lot of people up because he was also on hards while everyone else was on soft or medium tires. So he was holding up a lot of people, and because it was so hard to overtake, once Perez finally got past and put Carlos Sainz out of shape for the next few corners, everyone was able to capitalize on that. So you saw Albon get past Stroll, Leclerc, I think a few other, Alonso get past. No, Alonso was already ahead of him. Yeah, I think that was it for now. But that's kind of, if that moment could sum up that race where Perez gets past him, finally gets past him, and then everyone else is able to take advantage. In this race, you couldn't see people overtake unless the person ahead made a big enough mistake. Or, well, yeah, that's pretty much it. If they messed up in some way, so in this example, Perez passed Sainz, which put him offline, made him slower on the exit corner coming onto the front straight, which meant he was probably not even that much slower, but it was enough for Albon to get past, putting him even more out of shape, which let everyone else get through. And I mean, after that happens, nothing really else happens in this race. I mean, there's some small battles in the lower field. Sainz eventually gets past or Perez eventually gets past Alonso, but the race was pretty calm after that. Like I said, Verstappen wins. Norris gets a podium. Hamilton gets a podium. The rest of the top 10 is Piastri, Russell, Perez, Alonso, Albon, Leclerc, Sainz. The Logan Sargent in 11th, which was good, but not perfect. Definitely, he does have to start performing more. To be honest, he wasn't that far behind Albon, and I think he could have done better if qualifying was actually dry, and they could have. If qualifying was dry, they probably would have qualified easy in the top 10, maybe even top 5 for Albon. That would be kind of hard seeing it wasn't dry for qualifying, so we don't know. I think, yeah, like I said, overall it was a good race. The biggest standouts was Williams and McLaren. Both of them have improved greatly from the beginning of the season to a point where, I believe Williams, if not AlphaTauri, pretty sure it's Williams, has the most amount of available development for the season. So now that they actually have some better technical directors, some better staff, you're going to see them start improving a lot more because they have a lot more resources. Well, they have a lot more time and amount of development allowed to them for the rest of the season. So they can only be getting better, where teams like Red Bull and Mercedes and Ferrari can't develop as much, so you won't see them improve that much, which is supposed to level out the racing, but yeah, it's all right. I mean, it is kind of working. A big disappointment was Aston Martin. They should have been doing a lot better. It seems like since Canada, they've been slowly going down. Maybe they just haven't brought they didn't really bring big upgrades yet. So maybe you might see that later on. Alonso did say his best chance of beating Verstappen was going to be at the Hungarian Grand Prix, which is not a straight line track. So hopefully, next race we might see someone win differently than Verstappen. But I guess that's a good way to lead into the Hungarian Grand Prix, which is going to be this weekend. And July 23rd. The Hungarian Grand Prix has been going on since 1985, 86. There's not a lot of straights, like I mentioned before. It's a very technical track, so you're not going to see a lot of overtaking, if any at all. It's more of track position and how clean you can be throughout the entire race. So the main overtaking spots are turn 1 and turn 2. So those are probably not the in between turn 1 and turn 2 is not the longest straight, but the front straight, the main straight, because it's the longest straight, and you could potentially overtake with DRS. The straight following that allows it, if the person who is overtaking into turn 1 messes up a little bit, whoever's behind him could capitalize on that and overtake their spot back into turn 2. And then for the rest of the lap, you can't really overtake, so they would be good for a while. Most likely we would see a Red Bull victory. The Aston Martin said that they would do good. You're going to see Williams drop down only because this track doesn't have corners that really suit their type of car. McLaren, probably they won't do good either. I think Mercedes said they should be doing better here. Same with Ferrari. So hopefully you will see people actually challenging the Red Bulls, but you can never be too sure of what's actually going to happen. It is a nice track. It's in Hungary. So other than that, about the racetrack, it's just about that. I mean, it has had good races in the past. Most notably was 2021, where it was raining at the beginning and there was a big pileup at turn 1, which took out a lot of people. Essentially, Hamilton, who was the other dominant car. So in lap 1 of that race, you had both Red Bulls and one of the Mercedes get taken out. Then on the restart, Hamilton made a wrong decision. He ended up at the back of the field. And because it's really hard to overtake, what ended up happening, Ocon won that race. And all the midfielders were at the front of the field, which made it very interesting. Not saying that it's going to happen this time, but we could always hope. So, but the biggest news in terms of drivers, Daniel Ricciardo is going to be replacing Nick de Vries at AlphaTauri, because Nick de Vries, who I still think is a really, really good driver, probably one of the best, hasn't been performing at all. Literally, like, since the start of the season, has been behind, what's his name? Yuki Tsunoda. He's been not performing in the races. This is something Helmut Marko said, that Perez isn't, I mentioned this earlier. Perez isn't qualifying well, but at least he's doing good in the races and can actually potentially get podiums still, even starting from 15th. So he still has plenty of potential left in the race, where Nick de Vries isn't qualifying good. He isn't beating his teammate. He's doing terrible, to put it bluntly. And I think they finally had enough, and then they're bringing in Daniel Ricciardo, who hopefully can do better. And if he doesn't, then, well, you could say it was the wrong decision to sack Nick DeVries. But I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense because he did a one-off weekend with Williams and scored a point on his debut for Williams, or at least I think he did. He did really good in his debut. That's the main point. And everyone was like, he's really good. He's only had one race, and obviously he's like beat everybody. He's got to be good in F1, so he's finally got an F1. But for some reason in the AlphaTauri, he did really bad. So it'd be interesting to see if he actually had a different seat. So maybe go to Williams and replace Logan Sargent and see how he does there. And if he actually does well, then you could say there's something suspicious going on with that AlphaTauri. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. I think, yeah, you're probably going to see Red Bull win if nothing crazy happens. If something crazy happens, and then, to be honest, anyone could really win at that point. I had this talk or discussion with my brother, I think it was yesterday, and we were talking about the British Grand Prix, and I was just thinking about it, and I thought that track never really produces that great of races. And then that was just what I said, and so we discussed this further. What we came to the conclusion is that the changes that they made from last year's 2022 cars to 2023, and what they changed was the height of the skirts on the side of the cars that allow for the new ground effects to be very effective were raised in order to prevent the bouncing that they experienced last year for safety precautions, when really it was only Mercedes and they just kept complaining and complaining. So obviously the FIA did something about it, and then now the racing sucks. Why does it suck? Because they can't rely so much downforce on their undercarriage, on their floor, with ground effect, that they have to use more of their front wings and rear wings on top of all the downforce on the top of the car. So yeah, the wings, the side pods, the rear wing, yeah, all that. And now that they're more reliant on that, the dirty air heavily affects how much the cars can follow behind. And the DRS is still very, very powerful. So last year, you would see someone would overtake with DRS, get in front, but the person that they just overtook could still follow them very closely, where they could still challenge that person coming into the next lap and maybe take their spot back. Where this year, when someone gets passed on DRS, you can't follow closely enough because of the dirty air, because they're more reliant on their front and rear wings that's affected by dirty air. That now, coming up to the second lap, they can't challenge them because they're just too far behind, or it's just they can't follow close enough for the rest of the lap. I don't remember last year's race, but yeah, so if nothing happens dramatic in this race for the Hungarian Grand Prix, it's probably going to be really boring. Boring in the sense that there won't be any passes. Strategy could always be insane, because what if they show up and the tires just don't work properly? It's a 2-stop race, and they have to, they're figuring out as they go. So it's always different. It's always going to change. But we'll see. My name is Richard. This is the Anything F1 channel. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.